Hey everyone, Ranger William here from the Overmountain Victory National Historic Trail, bringing you another episode of Trail Talk, where we're getting into the stories behind the story of the Overmountain Victory Trail, the Kings Mountain Campaign, and the backcountry of the American colonies. Now, when studying the Southern colonies in the 18th century, we can discover huge cultural and economic differences between the coastal areas and the backcountry. Now, one of these differences is the racial diversity of the regions and the number of the enslaved people present. Now, for example, coastal South Carolina and Georgia, that was kind of leading the politics of the colonies in the Revolution, was dominated by plantations growing rice and indigo, with an estimated 70% of the population there being enslaved Black men and women. Now, these people were both Africans who had been enslaved in Africa and transported across the Atlantic Ocean, but also colony-born African Americans who had been born into bondage. Now, however, compared to that, in parts of the western colonial interior, the enslaved population plummeted to about 10% or less in some regions. Now, the impact of African culture can still be seen today throughout American and especially Southern culture, both in language, in food, in music. But what isn't always obvious is the impact that Black men and women made on the American Revolution. Now, starting as soon as 1775, the British government viewed the enslaved people held by patriot masters as a possible source for recruits. Now, this caused great fear for many of the American leaders. But Black men served in the American Army also, most notably with some New England regiments, the Rhode Island regiments, but at least 5 Black men are known to have been in the Patriot ranks as they assaulted Patrick Ferguson's Hilltop Army at the Battle of Kings Mountain. Now, one enslaved man, John Brodie, was known to have resembled Colonel William Campbell so much that he was actually confused for him during the course of the battle, and especially in post-war recollections. And a freedman from Virginia, whose name is only recorded as Bowman, claims to have fired one of the shots that killed Patrick Ferguson. So what was life like for these men and other people of color in the backcountry and on the frontier of the colonies? So to learn more about this overlooked part of our story, we're joined by Oriana Moore. Now, Oriana is a graduate of Winthrop University, where she specialized in mass communication and African American studies, and she has a lot of experience serving as an intern, a volunteer, and as a part of an advisory committee for Historic Brattonsville, where she is currently serving as the interpreter for African American history at Historic Brattonsville, and some of their great programs or videos can be seen on their website and their social media. So, Oriana, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So to kind of dive into our topic, always kind of starting at step one, kind of a nice step back, trying to understand the basic world of people of color on the frontier. This is an important place to start. So what are the various communities or situations that would result with Black men or Black women living on the frontier?
Yeah, so you kind of mentioned it in your intro a little bit, but for South Carolina, a majority of Africans or African Americans were residing in the low country of the state or the colony at the time. They were people who were taken from West Africa and enslaved and brought to the colonies as forced labor. And colonial South Carolina also has ties to the island of Barbados, which was also a British colony, which built a large economic presence off of slave and sugar economy during the 17th century. So the main crop that was cultivated in Barbados was sugar. And when that began to decline, planters looked to the Carolinas to settle. So when they settled here in South Carolina, they also brought enslaved Africans with them to the low country where rice, indigo, and cotton would have been cultivated. And then by the 18th century, white settlers are relocating to the backcountry from the low country and also from some northern colonies. And if they had enslaved people, they would have also been bringing them to the backcountry then. And that's how some enslaved Africans or enslaved African Americans ended up in the backcountry.
Okay, so you're seeing kind of different, I don't know, you call it kind of waves of migration, where you're seeing the people come from Barbados to the southern colonies, and then in the next century from the low country more into the backcountry. And as these planters, as these slaveholders make those changes, they're bringing the enslaved people with them.
Yeah, so some people are coming directly from West African countries. Some people are coming from West Africa through Barbados to the Carolinas. and some from other colonies.
Okay. What do we know about the enslaved people that were in the southern colonies? I know you just mentioned that they're coming kind of from West Africa and with maybe coming through Barbados, but do we know more about kind of what nations or regions these people were coming from? Kind of a little more of their background that way?
Yeah, so if we look at the makeup of African Americans today, if we were all to take a DNA or ancestry test, we would see that so many African Americans have a mixture of different ethnicities from Africa or different countries. So a lot of the nations that they were coming from were Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, Benin, Togo, the Ivory Coast, some West Central African countries as well, Angola, and the Democratic Republic of Congo are just some of the countries that a lot of people who are of African American descent originate, and that's where a lot of West Africans were taken from because of the different skills and work that they knew how to do. For instance, in Angola, they were really known for cultivating rice, so that would pique the interest of slave traders from the Carolinas.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, because I mean, with the rice kings, that major industry here in the Carolinas, they're definitely gonna, I can see, want people who know that crop, know that kind of work.
Right.
So I was gonna ask you more about, do we know kind of their route to the backcountry? You kind of already addressed that. So once these enslaved people were here in the backcountry on the frontier of the colonies, do we know how their life there would have differed from maybe what they had seen or experienced back in the Low Country or in Barbados? Was there a difference in either the kind of work, the kind of community that they had for support, but also maybe their chances of emancipation? What kind of big differences are they going to see here in the backcountry?
Yeah, so life as an enslaved person in the backcountry would have depended on who owned that farm or plantation. We know that during this time, plantations are smaller in the backcountry. It's not very common to have really large plantations as you see in those coastal areas. Like rice cultivation would have flourished in Low Country, but cotton would have been a more thriving crop in the backcountry. And so it really depended on that. And then also in the Low Country, there's more urban settings. So if you have enslaved people in urban settings, they're more likely to be hired out to work. They could be, building different structures, building canals, things like that.
Okay. And then now the other part of the question there about kind of their community, by there being fewer enslaved people in the backcountry in these more kind of isolated farms, do we see any changes in traditions, religion, family groups, any kind of changes to deal with that isolation?
Yeah, so what we do know about enslaved African Americans throughout the 18th and 19th century, being separated from families was common. So families could have been separated as people started traveling from the Low Country to the backcountry or from other colonies to the backcountry of South Carolina. A community was usually created through the shared cultures that enslaved African Americans both kept from West African cultures and created. So that could be through food. We know a lot of Southern cuisine has West African influences. That could be through music, the spirituals that they may have sung while working. It could be through clothing, wearing head wraps, or women wearing head wraps. So community would have looked a lot different for them. It would have looked like survival, just trying to find ways to get through the situation that they're in.
I like that the community is a way of survival. That's nicely said. So getting to more of the start of the revolution, looking back through the history of the colonies, like you're talking about with these plantations and these slave societies in the coast and in Barbados, in previous colonial wars between different European empires, the enslaved population of your enemy was viewed as a potential ally. Especially when you're looking at the English and the Spanish here in the South. Like, for example, down with St. Augustine in Florida and Fort Mose, the free black settlement there that was Spanish armed against the English. It's a very common tactic. But with the beginning of the American Revolution, you see this kind of same tactic used. One of the first attempts we see to recruit enslaved men into military service comes from Lord Dunmore's proclamation, the Royal Governor of Virginia in 1775, when he offers freedom to any enslaved man or a servant who escapes from a patriot master, a patriot plantation owner, and if they help the British Army fight against the rebels. Do we know kind of what effect this proclamation had on the enslaved community, not only there in Virginia, but further into the backcountry in other colonies? Kind of how fast this news would have spread?
Yeah, so I don't really know exactly how fast the news would have spread, but we do see that there were free and enslaved African Americans fighting for the Patriots or fighting for the Loyalists. For enslaved people, this would have been a difficult situation, a difficult decision for them to make, because in order for them to gain freedom, this meant that the British would have to win the war. So it's really, they would have to take a chance. Some enslaved men did fight for the British side for a chance to gain their freedom, and some were taken by the British because, as you said, enslaved people or African Americans during this time were seen as a way for the British to win the war, and then later on for Americans, patriots to win the war. So we know that in the end, that whether an enslaved person fought for the patriots or the loyalists, they weren't necessarily given their freedom either. And many who fought for the loyalists or the British were sold back into slavery in the Caribbean. Others who fought for the Patriots were returned to American plantations. And then there were a few who did receive the promise of freedom, and some African Americans who did go to Canada after the war. But it was one of those things where they had to take a chance if they were going to fight. We do see some enslaved African Americans who are fighting in place of their slave owners, so not by choice but by force. And the results of it really didn't help them in the end.
Right, because I mean, like just talked about with that last part there about the being sent as a substitute, you're being sent as a replacement to an army of the slaveholder's choice, still staying kind of like in the system. Service there ends, okay, and you're back where you were.
Yeah.
But like you were talking about with the kind of making that choice, if you're an enslaved person, do you support the British and hope they win? Do you support the Americans and hope that you're granted freedom for your service? Do we know if there was one that was kind of more successful in recruiting than another? Do we know if British offers? I know it's expanded from John Moore's proclamation in 75 to the Phillipsburg proclamation in 79, where Sir Henry Clinton kind of throws open the door a little more, trying to really attract enslaved men and women to the British Army. And I know at first George Washington opposes the idea of having black men in the Continental Army, especially enslaved black men. Being a Southerner, being a plantation owner, this is something that is very unusual and very kind of worrisome to him at first. But then you do see like you were talking about later on, the need for assistance, the need for manpower. The Continental Army opens its doors a little more, starts to allow more black enslaved men to serve, even though some colonies are still too worried. South Carolina, especially, very worried about the idea of arming enslaved men. But do we see in the end kind of, was there one that was more successful in recruiting efforts?
I would think that the British would have been more successful in recruiting African Americans to fight in the war, just because if you're recruiting first and you're offering freedom, then that's what they're going to be fighting for. African Americans at this time are fighting for freedom, for racial equality, for liberation from slavery, and but at the time we see that Americans are focused on another thing. They're focused on being free and independent from the British Crown. So it's one of those things where, you know, both are going to try to recruit African Americans or enslaved people during this time to benefit their side, but enslaved or free African Americans also have a different idea of why they want to fight if they're choosing to.
Yeah, it's very much what side is going to support my individual liberty rather than this legal organizational liberty. Okay, great. Now, talking a little bit about kind of with the end of the war. After the American Revolution, we see many soldiers submit applications for pensions. This is how they're going to describe their service. It's going to be how they prove that they were there. And these are huge sources of information for us today trying to research and learn about these people. Do we have any idea about how any of these Black veterans were viewed differently by the new nation, by the early republic?
So what we do know is that not all of the, or majority of these Black men who were fighting the war did not receive freedom that they were promised. There were a few cases where they were, their freedom was given to them as promised, but overall we see that slavery is not abolished, especially in the South. We do see northern colonies or northern states at this point, starting to put in legislation to slowly get rid of slavery. But in the South, it's something that's going to grow over time and become a full institution. And so we don't really see Black veterans getting the same treatment or honor as the white veterans from the American Revolution.
So looking kind of away from kind of some of the period sources and more into kind of like interpretation, some historians have made the argument that the American Revolution gained traction in the southern colonies because at this time leading up to the revolution, you're seeing a lot of attitudes in Britain kind of increasingly leaning towards abolition. You're seeing some abolition organizations start. You're starting to see a few court cases, especially one by Lord Mansfield in, I think it's 72. That are kind of against the idea of slavery. And so you have these colonial planters, these slaveholders joining the rebellion, fighting against Britain to protect the institution of slavery. Now, would you say that this is kind of, the historians I'm thinking of were saying that this is kind of the main reason that they would join the revolution? This is the main reason you would have Southerners join the cause, is to protect slavery. But would you say that this is, would you agree with that? Or would you say it's more just kind of like an additional piece of a larger puzzle?
So I would say that's a piece of a much larger puzzle because while preserving the institution of slavery was a cause for some Southern patriots, it depended on where you lived and how wealthy you were. So it would be a major influence for someone who was a wealthy plantation owner, but somebody who's a small farmer, it may not be that. If we look at the Carolina Piedmont, there were Scots-Irish settlers who were here who may have still had grievances with Britain. So it may not have been necessarily about slavery, but about past grievances between Scots-Irish and Britain, the Britain government itself. But in addition, there were other slight differences between the backcountry and lowcountry patriots. Before the Cotton Gin in 1793, we know that backcountry farmers didn't rely on enslaved labor as much or to the same extent as lowcountry Carolinians did. Mm-hmm. So preserving the institution of slavery may have been a motivation for lowcountry planters because it was so prevalent there and plantations were larger there and slavery was really something that they relied on in that area, but not as much of a motivation for small farmers in the backcountry. And then we also know that after the war, like I said earlier, those northern states start passing legislation to free enslaved African Americans, and slavery is something that's expanding in the South, but I don't think that that would have been the main reason for Southern patriots taking arms with the patriotic cause.
Right. Because like you're saying too, if the only people who are really feeling that that's something to fight about are the low country planters, these are also looking at different business interests. These are also your major merchants who are also going to be having issues with stamp taxes and import duties and all these other various reasons. So yeah, so not so much, the main hill that they want to die on, but it's one side of this die that is also covered with various other problems they have with the British government. But then, yeah, we can't forget that when we're looking at your average patriot, How many of these guys are going to be your coastal planters? How many of them are going to be plantation owners? How many of them are going to be wealthy merchants? And then how many of them are going to be small farmers? So a lot of differences as you look across the spectrum there. Now I want to kind of close up our time. We talked a lot about how things happened. We've talked about the history of different policies during the war, a little bit about after the war. But I want to look a little further after the revolution and kind of give you this kind of a little hypothetical what if question. Because when you look at the American Revolution, this is often talked about as kind of the dawn of the age of revolutions. You have the American Revolution, then the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, all kind of dominoing together. And with the French Revolution, you have these same basic ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which itself had been taken from the British Constitution. But you see that kind of change to liberty, equality, and fraternity. And these early French revolutionaries are going to make this a very broad policy. They're going to abolish slavery, which is going to kind of springboard the Haitian Revolution happening when the French later tried to reinstate slavery. But with these same principles, if you see the American Revolution also try to adopt these ideas with the same broad brush. If you also see the American patriots say liberty means for all, they abolish slavery, how do you imagine that would have kind of changed the course of the war, the course of history? Which I know is a huge question, but just if you wanted to do a little fun hypothetical there, how do you think things would have changed?
Yeah, it's one of those things that's really hard to imagine because of the results of the war, as far as how African Americans were treated, or if their promises of freedom weren't fulfilled during this time, and how that really was a catalyst for the rest of American history. I think if we're speaking hypothetically, it would have given Africans and African Americans who were in America during this time the chance to really get a head start on just rebuilding their communities. We know that after the Civil War, for instance, when emancipation did actually happen, that was a hard process in itself, just having African American communities trying to build schools and churches and things like that. So to imagine this happening so early on, it's hard to think about. It makes you wonder if race relations would have been better years later, hundreds of years later. It makes me wonder, would there have been this idea of maybe some Africans wanting to return? I know that's a common idea throughout history as far as African American history. Some Black leaders who have had the idea of returning to Africa, but I wonder if that would have been something that they would have wanted to do, since they were closer in generation to African countries.
Right.
It's definitely something to think about.
Yeah, because like you just said, you're looking like 100 years before emancipation actually does happen, and all the things that happened in that 100 years. If you're looking at the community of African Americans with 100 years less of oppression, 100 years less of a kind of more of an American identity before the introduction of King Cotton, and the total change of the slave society that you see happen with the introduction of that crop, the cotton gin, like you mentioned. Would that kind of Back to Africa movement have been more appealing? Would it have had more traction if it had happened 100 years earlier? It's a really interesting thought. Well, Oriana, I want to thank you for taking the time to sit and talk with us. This is definitely a part of our story that isn't often talked about, but it is definitely a part of American history, definitely a huge part of the American Revolution. And like we talked about with some of our kind of hypotheticals, but also looking at the British versus the American recruiting efforts, it could have gone a very different way with just a few small changes. So thanks for taking the time to chat.
Thank you.
And everyone who's been watching, this has been another episode of Trail Talk, where we're trying to get to the stories behind the story of the American Revolution, the American frontier, and the Kings Mountain campaign here in the Southern colonies. So thanks for joining.